Welcome back. With this video, with this lecture and this set of PowerPoints, we are moving forward in the Reformation to the third of the magisterial reformers. The first, Luther, of course, the essential man, the one whose influence extends to all the other reformers and beyond, even to the English Reformation, which we'll see when we get there. To Calvin, which we are turning to now. And some would say that Calvin had as large an influence as Luther, many more built upon Calvin's theology in some ways than Luther's theology. So which one is the more indispensable? Which one is the more significant of the reformers? I think that's kind of a fruitless debate. The Reformation wouldn't have begun without Martin Luther in quite the same way that it did, and probably wouldn't have had the same kind of impact in the manner that it did. And yet Calvin, in many ways, broadened and extended that, and so both deserve to be understood as absolutely key and essential men in the Reformation and in the history of theology, which is what our course is. So let us turn our attention to John Calvin, and we will understand his life and ministry. Acknowledging John Calvin is to acknowledge that he is the leader of the second generation of the Reformation. Calvin was born in 1509. Luther was about 25. Jean Calvin, as his French name would be, was just emerging from childhood in 1517 when Luther posted his 95 Theses in Wittenberg. Luther died in 1546. Calvin still had 18 years of life and ministry. So they represented two generations, and they also represented two temperaments. Luther, as we have seen, is a man of emotional intensity and rough fluency, sometimes to the point of harshness. We saw that he could even be polemical at times. And frankly, Luther was just cranking out material like crazy. We saw that his writings were very voluminous. Calvin was not a man of passion, but a man of intellect. He was untiringly polishing his institutes for the rest of his life, with the care of a lawyer poring over his briefs. And though he also produced a vast amount of writing, most of it transcriptions of his sermons, which he preached many times during the week when he was ministering in Geneva. Still, his writing was, again, more theologically precise than Luther's, although it built, again, on Luther's key doctrines, particularly justification by faith alone. So Luther was a man that had a man of passions and polemics. Calvin was a man of intellect and logic, so again, very different temperaments. Calvin was born on July the 10th, 1509 in Nyon, Picardy, France. Middle-class parents. His father was a lay administrator, that is, he had some administrative function in the church. He served the Bishop of Nyon, and as a result, Calvin, while he was still a child, received an honorary office in the cathedral that would basically pay for his education. Unlike Luther, Calvin was born into the professional class, received an excellent early education, and his name has come to us via a process. Calvin, as we've said, is French. Calvinus is the Latinized form of that French name, and Calvin is the anglicized form of the Latin, so known as John Calvin. Again, although he commenced training for the priesthood at the University of Paris, his father, because of a controversy with the bishop and clergy of Nyon Cathedral, decided that his son should become a lawyer instead, and sent him to Orleans, where he studied under Pierre de Latreille, and later he studied at Bourges under the humanist lawyer Andrea Alciati, and it was probably in Bourges that he became a Protestant, as Luther's ideas were beginning to spread across the continent at that time. He received his master's degree in 1528 and then studied law at the University of Orleans under pressure from his father, as we said, because of his father's growing discontent with the Roman Catholic Church. Apparently, this may or may not have been Protestant or Lutheran inspired, but nevertheless, it certainly would have had an influence on the young Calvin for his later life. In 1532, at the age of 22, he received his doctorate in civil law, and later he studied classics at Paris, and also well educated in theology, ancient languages, and rhetoric. In fact, his first writing was something in humanities, not in theology. He was a serious-minded young man and inclined to scholarly and contemplative studies, and he would spend his evenings alone in his room reading until the small hours. Always got up early to think about what he had learned the night before. And as a result of this rigorous study, devotion to the books and not his physical health, he started to have health problems very early on in life, and he would have health issues for the rest of his life, probably stemming from the bad habits that he had acquired in his early days at the university as such. He was always frail, endured a number of illnesses, and one author even went so far as to say a catalog of Calvin's afflictions would read like a medical journal. He was always, and for all of his life, not a well man. As his studies progressed, Calvin found himself drawn towards Protestantism. He'd been brought up a Catholic, but several family members, as we saw, his father had gravitated toward Luther's movement. Calvin really was among those who were influenced by Christian humanism, as we saw. And so as a liberal-minded humanist, he naturally felt sympathetic toward the Protestants who were being persecuted by the French authorities at this particular time. On his father's death, then, he returned to Paris, where he became involved with Protestants there. And as a result of some difficulties there, it's a much larger part of that story. Philip, of the King of France, started putting Protestants in jail and persecuting them, and they retaliated. Things just began to be a little bit chaotic for Protestants in Paris. So he left. He spent some time in Italy. Then he went to Basel, Switzerland. He was influenced by his friends and colleagues to completely break with Rome, the circles that he was moving in, which he did in 1534. And so for the next years, completely separated from the Roman Catholic Church and anything that had to do with that. He spent his time wandering around as a student, a sometime evangelist. He settled in Basel and hoped to spend the rest of his life there in quiet study. That didn't quite work out. The French persecutions eventually caused him to leave Paris in 1534, and he went to learn Hebrew in Switzerland instead. That's the time we were just talking about when he was in Basel. And there he published the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. At the time, the first edition was just a short book. He never intended this thing to become what it eventually was. The first book, the first efforts at the Institutes were really designed to be an apologetic to the King of France, Philip, to take it easy on the Protestants, that they were loyal Frenchmen and loyal to the king, and basically just to outline the basics of their faith, which he knew wouldn't be that much different than the Catholic Church in major doctrinal areas like the doctrine of God or the atonement. And so, again, he just wanted to show that Protestants were reasonable people and that they weren't the rabble-rousing demagogues that they were being painted by others. As we noted with Luther and with Zwingli, we need to talk about Calvin's conversion. His conversion undoubtedly occurred in the years 1532 to 33. His testimony was about this came many years later. Calvin mentioned simply in the course of one sentence of a letter that he'd written to Sadoleto, which he had a pretty lively correspondence with this Catholic that Calvin thought that he was moving towards Protestantism. This Catholic thought Calvin might be won back to Catholicism, but nevertheless, they had a lively exchange in terms of letters. And in one letter, in one sentence, he indicated that he had sought some profit, but he could not have been content to pursue his own studies in some respectable and free condition. In other words, Calvin recognized that he just wanted to go off to study, but that was not going to be possible. Unlike Luther, he did not have a dramatic experience, but not for that reason was it any less revolutionary for him. And as we will see for subsequent historical theology in the faith, he describes his move from the teachings of Rome to biblical Christianity as a change from papal superstitions to evangelical faith, from mechanical ceremonies to trust and faith, and from scholastic traditionalism to biblical simplicity. So he is pretty much describing again what we've seen with Luther and somewhat with Zwingli, but frankly a little more, sort of cerebral. He's thinking about it. There's no big sort of emotional change. At another point, however, he speaks of a sudden conversion, but not in the sense of a Damascus Road experience like the Apostle Paul, but it was like the climactic fall of a city by a final assault after a long siege. So he sees his conversion as something of a process, but there was a climactic moment. So he writes this: when I was obstinately addicted to the superstitions of the papacy, God subdued and reduced my heart to docility. Speaking of the sovereignty of God's work, he writes, Thou didst shine upon me with the brightness of thy spirit. Thou didst arouse my soul. He sees his conversion as a process. And again, there is a dramatic culmination of that, climax of that, that we would call his conversion experience. But mostly what Calvin wanted to emphasize is that in accord with his own theology of calling and election, it was God who chose Calvin. God illuminated Calvin with the light of his spirit. God's word was a living torch that spoke to Calvin's heart. God chose Calvin. Calvin did not choose God. This is the very formula of election that comes up in Calvin's theology later on. God mysteriously chooses certain beings. God chooses in the same way that he rejects without reason by an arbitrary action of his grace. It's not based on anything in us, like Romans 9. It's not based on anything that they have done, but according to his choice. That's how God elects and chooses. After wandering around France for a while, he decided to go to Strasbourg, a Protestant city. But while stopping overnight in Geneva, he was approached by an acquaintance of his, William Farel, who had introduced the Protestant movement to Geneva. And there was a considerable argument between Farel and Calvin, and eventually Farel persuaded Calvin to stay and help him in Geneva. Calvin later described it, God thrust me into the game. He was detoured during a journey to Geneva because of the war raging between Francis I, again the King of France, and Charles V. An old friend, Du Tillet, recognized him in the hotel, immediately informed again William Farel, and they had an encounter that ensued between Calvin and Farel, which is, as this author says, surely one of the most dramatic and significant in history. There's a woodcut drawing of it right there with Farel standing over Calvin, arguing with him. Here's the exchange. I'm going to read it for you. This is recorded for us in several places, but I've taken it from this account published by Sam Storms. So starts out with, "You're not leaving, that's off," shouted Farel. "There's much for you to do here." "What do you mean?" asked Calvin. "I'm sorry, but I cannot remain any longer than one night." Farel paid no attention. With great eloquence, he described the miraculous work of God in the city of Geneva and the need of a man of Calvin's stature and skill to come and teach. Calvin protested, expressing his desire to spend time writing in the safety of some remote city. "Leisure, learning, when it is a matter of acting," shouted Farel in indignation. "Do you want to desert the Reformation of the city? I'm at the point of breaking down under the load, and will you deny me your assistance?" Don't take it as ill will, said Calvin. My health is not the best. I need rest. What rest? Cried Farrell. Nothing except death brings rest to the servants of Christ. Do you dare put your personal interest ahead of the kingdom of God? Calvin quivered. The reproach of putting his personal comfort ahead of the service of Christ caused him severe qualms of conscience. A storm had begun in Calvin's soul as the two men wrangled throughout the night. Farrell was determined to break his resistance. Forgetting all formality, Farrell shouted, "For the last time, do you want to follow the call of God or don't you?" "No, no, no," shouted Calvin. Farrell's stature became erect, his eyes hurled lightning. "You're concerned about your rest and your own personal interest. Therefore I proclaim to you in the name of Almighty God and whose command you defy, upon your work there shall be no rest, no blessing. Therefore let God condemn your rest. Let God condemn your work." Actually, the word is stronger there than condemn. Wide-eyed, Calvin stared at the small lips which had pronounced this horrible curse. He trembled as it all suddenly became clear to him. Farrell was only an instrument, a vessel through whom the Lord himself was speaking. A feeling overtook him as bitter as death. He saw himself suddenly torn out of the path which had opened before him and found himself stationed in battle and unrest in the front line. As if under searing fire, Calvin's defiance melted, and as he offered his hand to the preacher, a tear rolled over his caved-in cheek. "I obey God," was his cry. Well, that's somewhat dramatic, but apparently that's pretty close to how it actually happened. So Calvin began a ministry in Geneva. Actually, this was his first ministry in Geneva, as the note says there. Why Farrell wanted Calvin to stay was because the Reformation was in trouble in Geneva. It was a town of only about 10,000 at the time, but Protestantism had taken only the shallowest of roots, and the other towns in the region, initially ruled by prince bishops, had successfully won self-government much earlier, but Geneva lagged behind, and largely due because its bishop was supported by the neighboring Duke of Savoy, and that was Catholic. So there had been iconoclastic riots in Geneva in the mid-1520s. Iconoclastic means breaking down the icons, literally, but that really doesn't mean icons. It means breaking down of the statues, the paintings, the candles, all of the things that were the accoutrements of the Roman Catholic ritual. Those have been there have been several riots and or movements to rid the church of those things, but these had negligible theological foundations. Protestantism had imposed on religiously unawakened Geneva, chiefly as the price of military aid in the province of Bern. In other words, the only progress in Protestantism was because of the military alliance between those two cities. The limited enthusiasm of Geneva for Protestantism reflected a resistance to religious and moral reform. And frankly, this continued almost until Calvin's death. It was never really a sort of complete Reformation. It was something of a struggle, at least in that political realm. The resistance was all the more serious because the town council in Geneva, as in other Protestant towns, exercised ultimate control over the church and the ministers and all the French refugees. The main issue was the right of excommunication, which the ministers regarded as essential to their authority, but which the council, that is the political council, refused to concede. So the uncompromising attitudes of Calvin and Farrell over this issue finally resulted in their expulsion from Geneva in 1538. So essentially, because they had this ongoing struggle with the political authorities, they were kicked out of the city. Trouble erupted when he and Farrell had sought to minister to both church and civil discipline, and again the two of them were kicked out of the town in April of 1538. Calvin was determined to return to Basel, where he had been, to resume his studies, but another reformer, Martin Bucer, pronounced both ways, who had was won to the Reformation while listening to Luther at the Leipzig debate, persuaded him to go to Strasbourg, which at one point Calvin had already determined to go to anyway, so that was fine with him. He spent some time there. We'd speak of this as the interlude in Strasbourg. He found refuge there for the next 3 years. It was a German Protestant city. He was the pastor there of a French-speaking congregation, refugees, who had fled the persecution of the Protestant in France. They'd gone to Strasbourg, but again, that was a German city. They needed a French pastor. That's what Calvin went there to do. While he was there, he lectured on the Bible. He published a commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. During his years, not only did he do a lot of good work theologically in terms of his writings and pastorally in terms of taking care of this French-speaking congregation, but it gave him a chance to learn a little bit more about how to do administration work from Martin Bucer, the chief pastor of that church, and that's going to come in handy for him later on. He taught theology, he trained candidates for ministry, he worked on a revision of his institutes. Again, he wrote his commentary on Romans, he pastored the church. He had come to the conviction that Strasbourg was going to be his home for the rest of his life. Again, it was in Strasbourg that he wrote some of his important treatises outside of the theological works that we just saw, his reply to Sadoleto. Cardinal Jacopo Sadoleto was a Roman Catholic who thought that he could bring Calvin back into the fold. Again, Calvin was a Protestant who thought he could convince Sadoleto that he should leave the Catholic faith. So it makes for an interesting reading in their exchange of writings. While in Strasbourg, Calvin married. We saw this. Luther got married, Zwingli got married, Calvin got married. Idelette de Bure in 1540. She was a widow who brought 2 children with her in her previous marriage. Her husband had been an Anabaptist, whom, again, ironically enough, Calvin had led to the Lord. She died. She lived 1549, so that was a good almost decade with Calvin. They had 3 children together. However, all of them died in infancy. By all accounts, although Calvin doesn't write about it a lot, all reports were their marital relationship proved to be very warm and loving, and in many ways emblematic of some of the other reformers who married and had very, very warm and helpful marital relationships. However, after 3 years, the City Council of Geneva begged Calvin to return, since the city lacked strong leadership, having also lost Farel. So Calvin declared that he would never return. He loved his new work, and he enjoyed Strasbourg. It was a good place for him. It was fairly safe, until several friends of his pointed out that he was behaving like Jonah, trying to run away from God's calling. And it's interesting that Calvin was susceptible to this kind of reasoning. We saw it with Farel in that dramatic exchange that we read, and apparently another person basically told Calvin, you don't get any rest. You have to be part of the struggle. You can't just sit back and enjoy it in a nice, quiet, easy place like Strasbourg. So once again, Calvin reluctantly bowed to what seemed to be God's will. He returned to Switzerland, and this time his stay in Geneva would be permanent. So in September 1541, he was invited back. The Protestant Revolution without strong leadership had become insecure, but he was now in a much stronger position. When he went there, he persuaded the town council to enact his own ecclesiastical ordinances, which basically means he won the fight that he apparently lost when they kicked him out. And he was now in charge of all the religious elements of his people's lives in the town. And so he encouraged, even required their religious education, especially religious education for their children, instituted Calvin's conception of church order. It established 4 groups of church officers, pastors and teachers to preach and explain the scriptures, and elders to represent and administer the church. They became the church officers for excommunication or church discipline, and then the deacons to attend to just the charitable responsibilities and other such requirements in administration. Again, in addition to setting up a consistory of pastors and elders to make all aspects of Genevan life conform to God's law, it undertook a wide range of disciplinary actions. So you can see again, this was the issue for which Calvin had to leave. Now, church discipline is in the hands of this, what this author calls a consistory of pastors and elders. We simply call it an elder board or Presbyterian elder board. Discipline could be exacted for false teaching, immorality, measures against dancing, gambling, and swearing, and other sorts of practical moral issues. Calvin expected nothing of the Genevans that he didn't also require of himself. He lived a decidedly austere life for his whole life, a thin, pale man. We saw that he had some health issues with a long beard, although that was the style at the time. He ate only one meal a day, didn't sleep very much. He was a severe workaholic. And a year before his death, and his friends advised him to take it easy, he angrily stated he had no intention of letting God find him idle. So you could see he was a man that could be cajoled into coming back to Geneva and continue on with his work because he never thought about something like retirement. While Calvin was there, he spent much of his time preaching and writing. He was the pastor of the Église Saint-Pierre and spent much of his time preaching. All of this in French, by the way. He was French-speaking. He maintained, as we said, a rigorous preaching schedule. He preached twice on Sunday and one time every other day of the week. Every other week, and he had secretaries who transcribed most of his preaching and teaching. In fact, that's another fascinating account. He had 4 secretaries that followed him everywhere he went, took down shorthand, and then one individual who took down the shorthand that the secretaries did into longhand. That would then be edited for sermons for publication. Calvin would be a part of that, and that's why he was able to preach through almost all of the New Testament and quite a number of Old Testament books, as well as continuing to work on the Institutes and write other theological treatises. The man, again, we've already said it, was something of a workaholic. In addition to the administrative and preaching duties, which were considerable, he devoted time to revising and expanding his institutes, as we just said, were transformed from a short outline of faith, basically just a small commentary on the Lord's, on the Apostles' Creed, into a massive, detailed, and highly structured exposition. At the same time, Calvin produced a number, as we've said, of biblical commentaries, remarkable quality, deep research. This wasn't just things he dashed off, which were praised by his theological opponents, as well as helpful to all of the other reformers. And like all the good reformers, he said about translating some of the Bible into the vernacular. Indeed, his works helped to establish and stabilize the French language in much the same way as we saw that Luther's translation of the Bible into German stabilized and standardized the German language. Calvin died in 1564. At his own request, his grave was marked by a plain stone, and today its location has been forgotten, which is what Calvin wanted. He didn't want anybody making pilgrimages to the grave of John Calvin. His influence throughout the Reformed world, including the Netherlands, Scotland, elements of England, America, Calvinism became a rigidly defined system of thought. We're going to see, it's going to come up again. Calvinism is going to be seen to be, as I said, influential in almost every Protestant movement from this point on, if not by those adopting his system, at least those who are responding to his system. Traditionally, Calvinism has been summed up by 5 points memorized by the word tulip: total depravity, unconditional election, that is, we're not saved by anything to do; limited atonement, that is, that Christ died for the elect specifically; irresistible grace, we're predestined by God to salvation or damnation; and the perseverance of the saints, the elect can never be de-elected, so to speak, or better to say that those who are genuine Christians will persevere to the end. It should be clear that this theology is something of a development and a simplification of what Calvin himself actually taught. But the lines are very hard to draw, especially even given that most Calvinists, past and present, would consider them first and foremost biblical Christians rather than followers of a 16th century Frenchman. So where does Calvin stop and Calvinism begin? Calvin was a serious-minded and compassionate man who spent many years trying to reason with the free-thinking Servetus before he was put to death. One of the you'll read about that in your reading in Bruce Shelley's book. But Calvinist theology has at some points in its development not been unfairly accused of losing sight of this compassionate basis. That is, Calvinists don't seem to be as compassionate as Calvin himself was. Calvin's legacy, again, has persisted not only in the Reformed churches of France, Germany, Scotland, Netherlands, we already said this, Hungary, but also the Church of England. And we'll see that, where Calvin was long at least as highly regarded as among those Puritans who separated from the Anglican Church. The Puritans organized their churches, Presbyterian or Congregational, and brought Calvinism to North America, and we will have a lecture about Puritanism later on. Well, as I said, that's Calvin's life and ministry. In the next set of PowerPoints and lecture, we will be looking at the institutes and some of Calvin's theology before we move on to some other elements of some other aspects of the Reformation, which we are continuing to study, and we'll pick it up next time.